Judge recognizes childhood friend on trial. What happens next will leave you in shock. Sophia Hayes sat in her imposing magistrate's chair in the county courthouse, surrounded by the usual murmurs that precede the start of a trial. To her, this setting was as familiar as the weight of the black robe on her shoulders. A new folder was placed before her by the court officer, accompanied by a brief statement. Next case, Jamal Jackson. The name made her heart stumble in an irregular rhythm. For a moment, the noises around her seemed to dissolve. Jamal Jackson. It couldn't be. Sophia's mind was flooded with a whirlwind of memories. The smile of a bright-eyed boy, laughter echoing across the hills of the small town where they grew up, the muffled sound of her father's reprimands. Taking a deep breath, she tried to contain the avalanche of emotions as she opened the folder. Jamal's face, now older and hardened by time, stared back at her in a mugshot, charged with robbery and murder. It was him. When Jamal was escorted into the courtroom, the words Sophia had rehearsed in her mind vanished. He looked different, the vibrant youth replaced by an expression marked by distrust and exhaustion. Yet something about him was unmistakably still Jamal, the boy with whom she had shared secrets and impossible dreams. For a moment, their eyes met. Jamal seemed to hesitate, his gaze betraying a flicker of recognition. But he quickly looked away, hardening his expression. Sophia, in turn, tried to mask the impact of that silent exchange. The courtroom was full, and any display of emotion would be seen as weakness. The prosecutor began presenting the case, outlining a narrative that was simple, almost lazy. Jamal had been captured on a convenience store security camera. The clerk accused him of pushing him before robbing the cash register. There were no additional witnesses or conclusive physical evidence, just a light criminal record that served as the foundation for the charges. As she listened to the prosecutor, Sophia felt a pang of unease. The presentation was shallow, the evidence weak. Still, she had to remain impartial. Then Madison Smith, Jamal's defense attorney, stood up. Young, with a confident demeanor, Madison had a spark in her eyes that signaled determination. "Your Honor, what we're about to see here is a classic example of how biases and careless investigations can lead to an unjust trial." Sophia leaned forward slightly, watching as Madison began to question the evidence. The grainy security footage showed only a man in a blue hoodie, with his back to the camera, committing the crime. Jamal was arrested because a local officer, familiar with his record, believed he fit the description. As Madison spoke, Sophia couldn't stop her mind from wandering to the past. She remembered when Jamal, still a boy, had been falsely accused of stealing apples at the market. Back then, he was kicked out of the store before he could even explain that he was just looking. She had done nothing to defend him. The trial continued, but for Sophia, every word seemed to echo the accumulated injustices of a lifetime. Sitting in that chair, she felt crushed between her professional responsibility and the emotional weight of confronting a piece of her past she had tried to bury. When the first day of hearings came to an end, Jamal was escorted out of the courtroom. Before disappearing through the door, he looked back once more, as if searching for something or someone. Sophia realized that look carried more than just hurt. It was a reflection of what years of silence had destroyed. Back in her office, alone, Sophia closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The once comfortable chair now felt like a throne of thorns. Jamal Jackson wasn't just a name on a case file. He was a living reminder of what could have been and what she feared could never be repaired. The clock marked the end of the workday, but Sophia knew the night would be long. The past, like an unwelcome visitor, had returned, and she would have to face it, whether she wanted to or not. The silence in Sophia's office was broken only by the faint ticking of the wall clock. She had tried to review other cases, but her thoughts kept drifting back to a time she thought she had left behind. It was a summer afternoon in the small town of Campo Sereno, where Sofia grew up. The air was thick with dust and heat, and the laughter of a little girl echoed through the sunflower fields. It was her, with her hair tied in 2 braids, chasing after a runaway kite. The kite finally landed on an old fence, and before she could reach it, a skinny boy with a mischievous smile and bright eyes appeared to help her. "Is this yours?" he asked, holding the kite like a trophy. "Yes, but I could have gotten it myself," Sofia replied, pretending to be indignant, though she was clearly relieved. "Maybe, but not as quickly. I'm Jamal." That was the first of many conversations. In the months that followed, the two became inseparable, sharing secrets, laughter, and small adventures away from the critical eyes of the town. Sofia knew there was something forbidden about their friendship. She was the daughter of a respected shopkeeper with a stable life and a big house. Jamal came from a family barely scraping by, living in a marginalized neighborhood. Despite that, they found refuge in each other. Jamal was fearless, creative, and always had a solution to their little problems. When Sofia's father made her spend hours studying, Jamal cheered her up by calling her to play by the nearby creek. When Jamal was the target of insults or disdainful glances at the market, Sofia defended him with the fierceness of someone much bigger than her 10-year-old self. There were moments, however, when the divide between them was impossible to ignore. Once, while playing in front of the church, a woman passed by, frowning. "You should know better than to associate with someone like that, young lady," she said to Sofia, her tone sharp with reproach. Sofia never told Jamal, but those words stayed with her. Even without fully understanding, she knew the town saw their friendship as something wrong. Everything changed one afternoon, shortly before Sofia turned 12. They were sitting under a tree, sharing pieces of a mango Jamal had rescued from a nearby orchard. Sofia remembers the sound of footsteps before she saw him, her father striding toward them, his face red with anger. "What are you doing here with him?" Sofia's father asked, his voice heavy with disapproval. "Dad, he's just my friend, Jamal," she replied, her heart racing. "Friend? You have no business being around his kind. Now go home." Sofia tried to protest, but her father's glare left no room for argument. Jamal, usually so fearless, just lowered his head. He said nothing, but the look he gave her as he walked away was enough to break her heart. That night, Sofia overheard her parents talking. "She has a future ahead of her," her father said, "and she can't be associating with people like him." It was the last time she saw Jamal for a long time. Not long after, she learned that he and his family had moved away. The memory of that day never left her. As she grew up, Sofia threw herself into her studies, determined to excel at everything. Becoming a judge was more than just a professional dream. It was her way of seeking justice in a world that always seemed stacked against people like Jamal. Back in the present, sitting in her office, Sofia felt the weight of guilt. She had obeyed her father, severing a bond that meant so much to her. Jamal, on the other hand, had been swept away by a current he hadn't chosen. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. It was the court officer bringing more documents for the case. Sofia thanked him with a nod, but her mind was still trapped in the past. That night, alone in her apartment, Sofia opened a forgotten drawer and found a faded photograph. In it, 2 children laughed together under the shade of a tree. Her eyes filled with tears. That boy was now a man, falsely accused, and she knew that in some way she had contributed to his plight by walking away. Sofia closed the drawer with determination. Whatever had happened in the past, she couldn't let the shadows of that time stop her from doing what was right now. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, curious onlookers, and even some community members who seemed to have already formed opinions about Jamal Jackson's case filled the room. The cold lights illuminated Sophia Hayes as she adjusted her glasses and prepared for the formal presentations to begin. The prosecutor, a middle-aged woman with a commanding presence, opened the proceedings with a straightforward but emotionless narrative. Ladies and gentlemen, the defendant, Jamal Jackson, was identified as the perpetrator of a robbery at a downtown convenience store. He was captured on security cameras and recognized by the clerk, who was assaulted during the incident. The prosecution will prove that Mr. Jackson, with a history of transgressions, is guilty of this crime. Jamal, sitting beside his attorney, maintained a neutral expression. Only those paying close attention would notice the tight grip of his hands, betraying the tension he was trying to conceal. The prosecutor called her first witness, the store clerk. A young man with a weary expression took the stand. Sophia noticed the nervousness in his demeanor. "Can you confirm that the man here today is the one who robbed the store?" the prosecutor asked. The clerk hesitated before responding. "Well, he looked like the man in the video." "Does he look like the man, or is he the man?" the prosecutor pressed, trying to strengthen the statement. "I think it's him," the clerk replied, clearly uncertain. Sophia jotted something down in her notebook. The clerk's uncertainty was already a weak point. Next came the presentation of the security video. A shaky, low-resolution recording was projected onto a screen. It showed a man in a blue hoodie facing away from the camera with indistinct features. He appeared to take something from the register as the clerk recoiled. Madison Smith, Jamal's defense attorney, stood up immediately after the video was shown. "Your Honor, let it be noted that the video does not offer a clear identification of the defendant. There is no physical evidence linking Mr. Jackson to the crime beyond assumptions based on this poor-quality footage." The prosecutor shot Madison a sharp look, but didn't counter. She knew the argument was valid. The next witness was the officer who had arrested Jamal. He described finding Jamal wearing a blue hoodie similar to the one described by the clerk, but admitted he hadn't found the stolen item or any concrete evidence at the scene. "Did you have any evidence besides the hoodie to arrest him?" Madison asked during cross-examination. "Well, his record," the officer began, but was cut off. "I didn't ask about his record. I asked about evidence. Anything concrete?" The officer hesitated. "No, ma'am." Sophia observed everything closely. It was clear that the case against Jamal had more gaps than solid proof, but that didn't stop the courtroom from seeming predisposed to convict him. The atmosphere felt charged with unspoken judgments, based more on Jamal's appearance and past than the evidence presented. As the prosecution continued to present its case, largely circumstantial rather than conclusive, Sophia couldn't stop intrusive thoughts about Jamal's past. He had always been unjustly accused. In school, he was the first to be blamed for any trouble, even without proof. It was a repetitive pattern. As the afternoon wore on, the prosecutor, realizing the weaknesses in her case, began emphasizing Jamal's history of minor offenses, petty thefts, and resisting authority, all from years ago. Sophia frowned. She knew that a record like this could bias the jury against him, even if it had no real connection to the current case. When the day's proceedings ended, Sophia sat in her chair for a few moments after the courtroom had emptied. She reflected on how the system seemed to set traps for people like Jamal. Small mistakes became chains that bound them forever, making it nearly impossible to rehabilitate or find true justice. That night, back in her apartment, Sophia felt the weight of her thoughts. Staring out at the city through her window, she knew the trial was just beginning. But one thing was clear. Jamal Jackson wasn't just fighting the charges against him. He was fighting an entire system that seemed to have condemned him before he ever stepped into that courtroom. The courtroom was in absolute silence as Jamal Jackson was called to testify. The air felt heavy, charged with tension and expectation. Many in the audience, and even some on the jury, had already formed opinions. After all, Jamal was no stranger to the judicial system. But what would he say? And more importantly, would it be enough to shift the direction of the trial? Jamal walked to the witness stand with steady but deliberate steps. He wore a simple shirt, carefully chosen to suggest humility, but also dignity. He sat down and looked directly at his defense attorney, Madison Smith, who gave him a brief nod of encouragement. "Please state your name for the court," Madison began, opening her questioning. "My name is Jamal Jackson. I'm 33 years old, I work as a construction laborer, and I live in the Jardim das Flores neighborhood." There was a pause before the next question, allowing his words to settle. "Jamal, you're accused of robbery and murder at a convenience store. How do you plead?" "Innocent," he replied, his voice steady. "I did not commit this crime." Madison skillfully guided Jamal's testimony, focusing on establishing his narrative. "You've had run-ins with the law before, haven't you?" Jamal took a deep breath. Sophia noticed the slight tension in his posture. "Yes, I have. I've done things I'm not proud of when I was younger. I committed petty thefts, got into fights. But that was a long time ago. Since then, I've worked hard to change my life." There was a murmur in the courtroom. Sophia observed closely, feeling a mixture of pride at Jamal's courage and sadness at how much he had to justify himself. "And what happened on the night of the crime?" Madison continued. "I was on my way home after working at a construction site. I stopped by a friend's bar to pick up some tools I had ordered. I stayed there for a few minutes talking and then left. When I got home, the police were already waiting for me." "Why didn't you ask your friend to testify on your behalf?" Madison asked. Jamal hesitated before responding, his voice quieter now. "Because he's scared. He's had problems with the police before, and he thinks that if he says anything, it might get him in trouble. I didn't want to drag him into this." Jamal's sincerity was palpable, and Sophia could see the impact of his words on the jurors' faces. It was hard not to connect with someone who owned up to their past mistakes without excuses, but denied the current accusations with conviction. Madison then asked the question that seemed to weigh the most. "Jamal, do you feel like you're being judged for your past rather than what actually happened in this case?" He sighed and looked at the jury, then at Sophia, as if his words were directed at her as well. "Yes, I do. It's always been like that. Ever since I was a kid, I was always blamed, even when I didn't do anything. It was easy to point the finger at me because I'm the son of poor parents, because I grew up in a place where no one gets a chance. I made mistakes, but I paid for them. Now I'm here again, fighting not just these accusations, but everything people have already decided about me before they've even heard me out." The courtroom fell into absolute silence. Sophia felt a lump in her throat. Jamal's words echoed something she knew to be true, but had never faced so directly. The prosecutor tried to weaken his testimony during cross-examination, highlighting Jamal's record and suggesting he had reasons to lie. But each of his answers was firm and clear. "I can't change who I was," he said in response to an attack on his credibility. "I can only show who I am now." When Jamal stepped down from the witness stand, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. He was no longer just a defendant. He was a person with a story, with flaws, but also with dignity. As Sophia adjusted her posture in the judge's chair, she knew that testimony had changed something within her, not just in the case, but in how she saw Jamal, the system, and even herself. As the courtroom dispersed for a recess, she glanced at him briefly. He didn't look back, but Sophia knew his message had been received. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, Jamal didn't seem so alone. The courtroom was utterly silent as Madison Smith stood up, adjusting her blazer slightly. Her firm posture and confident gaze signaled that she was about to shift the trajectory of the case. It was time to challenge the weak evidence presented by the prosecution and expose the negligent investigation that had placed Jamal Jackson in the defendant's seat. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, it is time to uncover the truth behind these accusations, Madison began, her tone blending indignation with determination. She walked toward the screen where the security video had previously been shown. This video, the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, has been used to try to link my client to this crime. But let's watch it again, carefully. The video was replayed in slow motion as Madison pointed out critical details. Observe the man in the video. He is wearing a blue hoodie and has a generic build. There are no visible facial features. Furthermore, the video is low quality and the images are blurry. Your Honor, let the record show that the defense consulted a digital imaging expert who concluded that this video is inconclusive for identification purposes. The expert, called by Madison, was brought in to testify. He explained, using clear and simple terms, that the video lacked the resolution necessary to definitively identify the person in it. So can we state that there is no way to guarantee the man in the video is Jamal Jackson? Madison asked. No, ma'am. There is no way to guarantee that, the expert replied. The prosecution tried to refute the claim, but the damage was done. Madison's next move was even bolder. She called the arresting officer to the stand. The room grew tense. Everyone knew he was an influential figure who didn't like being challenged. Officer, you mentioned earlier that you arrested the defendant based on a description provided by the clerk in the video. I'd like to ask, did you find the blue hoodie mentioned during the arrest? The officer hesitated before responding. No, we did not find the hoodie. And any other physical evidence? Stolen cash? Fingerprints at the store? No, ma'am. Madison leaned forward slightly, her voice gaining intensity. So, the arrest was based solely on a generic description and Jamal Jackson's criminal record. The officer looked visibly uncomfortable, but couldn't deny it. Yes. The impact was immediate. The murmurs in the courtroom reflected the jurors' surprise, many of whom were clearly beginning to question the legitimacy of the investigation. Madison then turned her focus to the store clerk, whose previous testimony had been inconsistent. She questioned him again, this time about why he had identified Jamal. I thought it was him because the officer said it was, the clerk admitted reluctantly. From her seat, Sophia felt a pang of indignation. It was evident that the case against Jamal had been built on assumptions and biases. The most revealing moment, however, came when Madison questioned the prosecutor about why the video hadn't undergone more detailed analysis before the trial. The investigation was conducted with the urgency necessary to apprehend the suspect, the prosecutor replied defensively. Urgency or negligence? Madison shot back, challenging the prosecutor to answer for an investigation that was now unraveling before everyone's eyes. As the defense dismantled the prosecution's case piece by piece, Sophia felt the weight of the trial pressing on her shoulders. As a judge, her duty was to remain impartial, but she couldn't suppress the whirlwind of emotions swirling within her. She thought about all the times people like Jamal had been dragged into court without anyone questioning the lack of evidence, about how the system she upheld often failed to protect the vulnerable, instead perpetuating cycles of injustice. By the end of the day, as the court recessed for a break, the tension was palpable. Sophia knew she was witnessing something far greater than a simple criminal trial. It was a battle against a system that frequently relied on biases and flawed patterns. As the courtroom emptied, Jamal looked at Madison with an expression that blended gratitude and hope. For the first time in a long while, he seemed to believe that justice might truly be possible. Sophia, on the other hand, felt the weight of her own reflection. She couldn't avoid confronting the truth. The system to which she had dedicated her life was flawed, and perhaps it was time to do more than just apply the rules. perhaps it was time to start changing them. The courthouse clock read 5 minutes to 2 in the afternoon as the jury returned to the courtroom. The tension was almost tangible. The silence was broken only by cautious footsteps and the muffled sound of restrained breathing. Sophia Hayes sat in her judge's chair, trying to project the calm and neutrality her position demanded. But inside, her heart pounded like a drum. Jamal Jackson sat beside his lawyer, Madison Smith, keeping his gaze fixed forward. His expression was unreadable, but his clenched fists betrayed the weight of the moment. The clerk instructed everyone to rise as the jury handed their verdict to the bailiff. An eternal moment passed before the jury foreperson stood to announce the decision. In the case of the state versus Jamal Jackson, on the charges of robbery and murder, the jury finds the defendant not guilty. A collective exhale swept through the room. Some who seemed to have come solely to see Jamal convicted shifted uncomfortably. Others celebrated quietly, among them Madison, who placed a reassuring hand on Jamal's shoulder. Jamal closed his eyes for a brief moment, his tense posture relaxing slightly, but there was no joy, only deep exhaustion. He knew this victory didn't erase the years of injustice he carried. Sophia struck the gavel to conclude the trial and announced, "The court thanks the jury for their service. This case is dismissed." As the room emptied, Sophia remained seated, watching Jamal. He was surrounded by Madison and a few people who seemed to know him, but soon his gaze met hers. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the space between them heavy, with something neither time nor circumstances had fully erased. Jamal walked toward her. The court officers hesitated, but Sophia signaled for them to let him pass. He stopped a few steps away, looking at her with a mix of hurt and resentment. "Congratulations, Your Honor. Justice served, right?" he said, his tone bitter. Sophia swallowed hard. She didn't respond immediately. "Jamal, you've been acquitted. That's what matters now." "Does it, though?" He stepped closer, his voice low but charged with emotion. "You don't get it, Sophia. I didn't win anything today. I just didn't lose again. But you had the chance to do more than just follow the damn rules." Sophia stood, trying to maintain her composure, but Jamal's words cut through her defenses. "Jamal, she began, but he interrupted her. "You always had a choice, Sophia. Back then, when we were kids, you could have fought. Today, you could have done more. But you chose to hide behind that robe, those rules. It's easy, isn't it? Pretending this is justice when you know everything was rigged against me from the start." Sophia felt the guilt swelling in her chest. She knew he was right. "Jamal, I know I failed, and I'm not going to apologize because I know words aren't enough, but I want you to know that I'll use what I have to change what I can. I can't undo the past, but I can try to stop it from happening to others in the future." He looked at her for a long moment before shaking his head. "I hope you can. Because people like me don't have time to wait for the system to work." Without another word, he turned and walked out of the courtroom. Sophia stood there, watching him leave, carrying on his shoulders the weight of a life shaped by inequality and prejudice. Back in her chambers, Sophia sat in her chair, but this time it didn't feel comfortable. The robe felt heavy, almost suffocating. She looked at the papers on her desk and felt that something had changed within her. The system she had sworn to protect and serve wasn't perfect. In fact, it was fundamentally flawed, and for so long she had been complicit, but this didn't have to be the end. That night, as she gazed out over the city from her apartment window, Sophia made a decision. It wasn't enough to enforce the law. She needed to question it, confront it, and, when necessary, transform it. Jamal Jackson was free, but his fight continued. And now, Sophia understood that it was her fight too. The world wouldn't change overnight, but she could start. Not just as a judge, but as someone who understood that true justice was far more than following the rules. It was about understanding people, hearing their stories, and fighting to ensure that everyone had a real chance to live without invisible chains. That night, for the first time in a long while, Sophia felt ready to face whatever came next. And this time, she wouldn't shy away from the responsibility of making a difference. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you did, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought about the story. See you in the next video.